to episode 426 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Björn Geesmann. Björn is probably most well known as the coach of Patrick Lange and Kat Matthews, and he was first on the podcast back in episode 291, so I very strongly recommend listening to that episode as well if you do enjoy this one. But don't worry, you can start with this one and then go back. There's no particular order necessary, but I think that's more than enough chit-chat because the interview is very, very long. So let's just thank our sponsors and then we'll dive into the chat with Björn. So first, thank you to Precision Fuel and Hydration. They help athletes personalize their hydration and fueling strategies for training and racing. You can use their free fuel and hydration planner to get a personalized plan for carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid intake in your next event. And if you want even more help, why not book a free 20-minute video consultation to chat through your plan with the athlete support team. As a That Triathlon Show listener, you can get 15% off your first order of products by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Senate. The Senate Indoor Swim Trainer allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. You can target specific aspects of your stroke, like catch and pull through, and work on technique or power. And the design of the bench forces you to constantly work on core activation, which can help your body position in the water. Most importantly, you can stay consistent in your training even when you don't have time to go to the pool. You can try the Senate risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on senateswimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the interview with Björn Geesmann. Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, Björn. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me again. Doing fine, a bit busy, but all good in the end. I mean, as long as it still makes fun, it's fine when it's sometimes a bit stressful. Therefore, totally okay. And honestly, highly, how can I say that? Highly ambitious by having a look at the triathlon season 2024, because it's going to be a fun one, I think, especially in pro triathlon. So therefore, awaiting it, and all good.
Yeah, no, the season is going to be something extra, I think, with all the changes, the T100, the Olympics in the same year. Yeah, it's exciting. For listeners that may not know about you, you have been on the podcast before, of course, I'll link to that in the episode description, but can you give a brief introduction to who you are and what your background in sports and triathlon is?
Sure. I think I was on the podcast in 2021. You already texted me yesterday, which was fun because 2021 was a really nice year with winning the Ironman in Tulsa and the challenge in Roth with Patrick Lange. And also the first year after all that COVID stuff, still some of you will remember out there. I'm Björn. I'm 36 years old, at an age where it does not really count how old you are, as you see. Coming from Hamburg, Germany, I'm a studied sports scientist and working in several parts in triathlon. For example, training a handful of pro triathletes, having a bigger German institute with 3 locations called High Size, which cares for age group and amateur and professional athletes in cases of coaching and bike fittings and performance diagnostics and aero fittings and aero testings. Running a big community coaching with the German Triathlon magazine, which is getting bigger and bigger, called Power and Pace, which is a fun project also. Actually building a wind tunnel in southern Germany for cyclists and triathletes only. And that's mainly it. So when it comes to triathlon.
Yeah, well, everybody will understand when you say that you're busy hearing all of the projects that you've got going on, that makes sense. And the wind tunnel project is something that I want to talk more about a bit later in this interview. So we'll get to that. But I want to start with, I went back and listened to our previous discussion. And one of the things we talked about was how you've done some education within psychology. You have a background in sports science, but then you have done further education in psychology as well. And you talked about how important that is in your coaching process. You discussed doing psychological profiling of athletes when you onboard them and so on. Can you go freely talk about a bit more about how you use and see psychology within your coaching process for you and from the athlete side as well? And then I'll have some follow-up questions on that.
Yeah, I mean, when we say that I'm into psychology, I would say on a scale from 1 to 10, I'm 1 to 1.5 probably on the knowledge you can have in psychology. So very, very low. But at least 1, as I once realized when I started, especially working in pro triathlon, because it's probably even more intensive than the normal age group coaching, because you are having daily contact to them. Sometimes you're also living with them in a house on training camp or travel with them to races and everything. And then at some point I realized that the classic, let's call it soft skills I had were pretty limited when it came to whatever you need psychology for, whether it's motivating, taking anxieties, calming down, activating the athlete, whatsoever. And then I did a little degree in mental coaching, which, to be honest, firstly helped me and myself to get to know myself better than before, which was also good for the whole coaching process. Because, I mean, again, soft skills and some kind of intention you have in your daily work. And then I realized that my initial thought or idea or action was probably not the best, especially for the athlete then. And then I asked also myself in the retrospective why I acted this and that way and how my personality was part of that one. And then I realized that it wasn't probably always matching with the athlete, and found good solutions what I could do better next time. And then I did this degree, and then still evolving and having brief discussions with a now also friend of mine who is a psychologist and who I do a lot of also work together with. So every time an athlete has a, let's say, challenge which I can't handle psychology wise, then I recommend them to meet him. And then he's doing the real psychology work, let's say. So whenever you have a trauma or something, then I'm definitely not the right one. That's why I'm saying on a scale from 1 to 10, somewhere between 1 and 1.5, hopefully. But due to that, you have a lot of discussions and about the whole psychology linked to an athlete, to the athlete's personality. And then you learn a lot. We also sometimes do a little podcast, sorry, it's in German, where we are discussing several tools you have, for example, mental coaching tools. And in the end, that helped me a lot to better understand myself, better understand the athlete, and understanding and acting in a way where hopefully it's in total better for especially the development of the athlete in certain situations.
So can you give an example of a scenario, a situation that you may have been in before doing any of this education, when you were maybe at 0 on the scale? And what did you do then that you would now do a better job now that you have a bit more understanding?
I think there were, and it's always like every time in life, it's always the bad situations when you realize you're not super well equipped with tools to get out of a conflict situation, let's say. And therefore, it have been conflict situations where I did not understand why this challenge is a big problem for the athlete. And I couldn't see the problem myself. So we had a disconnection in there. The athlete had a problem, and I couldn't understand why the athlete had a problem. And then if that's a process lasting for hours or days, and you do not have the chance to really get out of it just because of understanding problems first, so not like ongoing discussions, finding solutions for better understandings and everything, then like again, every day in life, it crashes at some point, and there's minimum an argumentation or a fight, however you call it. And that led myself and the athletes sometimes to situations where, you did not have any outcomes which were really, really nice to have. And therefore, I thought that it definitely makes sense to not see the problem just on the side of the athlete and think myself, well, it's her or his problem. I don't see it, and therefore I must be right or wrong. But to better understand why it's a problem for the athlete, what he or her needs in this situation, probably also not only to directly close that case or get rid of the problem, but to open him or herself to have a discussion about it or a talk about it, so that I can better understand why there is a problem with this and that. And again, always conflict situations, not that there were much of it, but one to really precise, not like shocking, but really direction leading conflicts, which led to a split up, for example, in the athletes and coaches relationship. And therefore, I thought, if I want to work in professional triathlon, then I'll have to dig deeper into the understanding of personalities and why they are different to me, and how we can get better on the same page of understanding.
So is a lot of it, one of the key things is for you to understand different personality types and be able to put yourself in their shoes, basically.
Yeah. And then you'll have daily situations where you'll always think of the, let's say, meta level, whenever it comes to whatever, motivation ahead of a race, calming down 5, 6, 7 days ahead of a race, motivating for training, activating for the race, preparing for certain race situations. I mean, like, you know that better than me, but a long distance triathlon race is a very, very long race, and you'll go through every feeling you can have, from probably a bit of anxiety at the beginning of the race, then getting some self-confidence because you had a good swim, then again getting in trouble because you lost a rear wheel and a group probably, and so on and so on. And then with all these mental coaching degrees and discussions, I often thought that now I have a better understanding of how the athlete probably feels and how I can interrupt, but how I can help the athletes even in the race, because we see quite often also in the race, and you still have the chance to say at least a sentence or two, and probably that helps. And before that, or so that it can help, you need to know a little bit more about the personality and understand it better than I did it before, let's say.
Can you give maybe one piece of advice for a certain common psychological situation that athletes might struggle with? So this might be, some athletes are more anxious and they might struggle with that, whether it's in racing or training. Others maybe struggle with motivation. So you can choose whatever scenario, whatever issue it is, but if you choose the issue, and then one tip for how athletes can maybe learn to improve how they're handling those issues.
Impatience and acceptance of that. So let's take the typical example where every triathlete can really call himself one who already had that problem, like being ill or having an injury. And I bet that every triathlete is in some case impatient with that. So nobody says, well, I got a cold. I'm happy that I do not have to exercise for the next 2 weeks. And sure, I wait until I'll be healthy again, and then even 3 days more to be 100% safe, and then I start training again. This is something I never heard in my entire life. So, and therefore this impatience is sometimes the thing that it's definitely there. And the question then is how strong it will be. Is it something where you at some point can accept that you are ill and you know you'll have to wait, and you probably also trust your coach's advice to not train in the next 5 days? Or is it something, and you're fine with it, or is it something that really impacts your mood to being very, very bad and ruins your days and leads then not only to being ill, but also to being whatever, minimum grumpy, to sad, probably developing an anxiety thinking about the next weeks of training, or probably the race, which is coming up in 3 weeks and everything. And then what I often touched was the case of acceptance, to say, well, sure, you can be grumpy now that you are ill, and you can be it in every second you are ill, and then it lasts for minimum 3 to 5 days. Or you can try to accept the situation that you are ill, probably concentrate on other stuff, probably enjoying things you could also do when you are ill. You can have good food, you can probably drink a good glass of red wine, whatsoever, and you won't make the illness worse. One glass, not probably more than one. And then you can at least solve the mood a little bit, due to the acceptance that you are ill now. And that is often a discussion you're having, not like weekly, because the handful of pro athletes isn't ill or sick or injured weekly, but whenever it's there, then it's always, in my opinion, a good tool also especially for the coach, to give the athlete the confidence that it's totally fine to be ill now. And just, I think it's more due to my personality, then also give a rational view on it, why it is okay to be ill. Because let's say your next race is, I don't know, end of April, let's take the actual time point, and we're having mid of February, and you're ill for 5 days, so it won't ruin your whole preparation leading up to the race. And then from a rational perspective, pointing out and giving the overview about how many trainings she or he already got into the books, how many weeks of training there still are before heading to the race, and therefore it's fine to have 5 days of whatever, being sick, for example, and developing an acceptance which leads to a mood way more relaxed and satisfied than normally. And then, in my opinion, helps a lot to prevent also other issues. So like bigger anxieties, thinking about the next race preparation, for example, which then definitely will develop even more. And yeah, and I think everyone can compare to being somehow impatient, really sick of being ill or injured, and then sometimes also starting too early. And that's the best example for not having accepted the situation that it will last for a week, starting too early and developing some kind of sickness, which then lasts way longer than before because you've been impatient and did not accept the situation, and then probably are ill for another like 2, 3, 4 weeks and made it even worse than it was before.
Yeah, that's a great and very relatable example that I think, we all have definitely been in that situation. Another topic that I wanted to revisit a bit is running economy, which we discussed last time. So just to remind the listeners, if they have listened to that interview but maybe don't remember so much, is that we talked about adding things like plyometrics, strength training, and also one thing that you mentioned was that you quite rarely, I mean, you don't do a lot of purely easy runs, but you do runs that have a little less sprinkles of some moderate intensity perhaps, and to basically work on economy with a slightly, the running form of slightly faster running, nothing crazy, but adding those sprinkles into a lot of the normal runs. So can you discuss this in more detail? Is this still how you approach improving running? Because since we talked, Patrick had then just ran 2:36 something in Tulsa, and you said that you weren't sure if it's possible to run 2:35 and 2:34. Now he's done a couple of 2:30. Ironman marathons. So clearly things have continued to work well. But yeah, is this still the approach? Has anything changed, or what can you add about running and running economy?
It's fun that you wrote that down. Yes, and I read that yesterday and had to smile because when I when I started working with Patrick, that was in 2019. So shortly before COVID hit, and he had his really bad Kona race when he needed to stop in quite high. And we started working like 4 weeks after something. And then I got asked pretty often by the German media, especially, or also international media, something like, well, you can't develop his run anymore because he's already run a 2:39 something, like he had in Kona, for example, twice. But how do you want to develop his bike, right? And I was like, well, why can't I develop his running anymore? Because I mean, I do not know any pro athlete who would go into a coaching or training saying that he does swim, bike, and run now, and two of the disciplines he trains just to get the state back again he had before. So everyone wants to develop something, and everyone wants to develop every discipline. And I do not know anyone who doesn't want. And greetings to all the media people asking that. It's now 10 minutes less. So probably not 10. It's like 9 minutes something, but it will be 10 minutes less in 2024. So just a statement. So I'm 100% sure Patrick will break the 2:30 barrier and run 2:29 this season. Therefore, fun anecdote about how you can develop running performances even if you're already going good. But then, to be honest, I needed to smile because I thought doing the Tulsa race was already a great run performance. And I, for myself, thought, well, that's already like 3 minutes on a marathon distance, winning then that race. And I was pretty satisfied with that one. And then he developed even more and even more and even more. Running Challenge Roth, I think in the same year in September when it was delayed due to COVID, and then the World Championships in 2021 got postponed into St. George in May, and then we spontaneously, like with maximum 10 days in advance, we decided to race Roth. And he won it, and I think that was one of the first times he already ran 2:35, more or less. I'm not 100% sure. And then the year after, Israel with 2:30. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to running economy, and I hope that's the same I said last time when we're having the podcast, is running economy is probably the biggest black box we have in training. So sure, you can get out papers showing you what helps to develop your running economy. That's pretty easy. But even if you look at the papers, the scientific ones, you'll see tons of stuff you can do to increase or make your running economy better. So therefore, decrease, let's define running economy, the oxygen you need per, let's say, kilometer per hour or minutes per kilometer, for example, depending on how you want to have the unit for speed. But you need less oxygen, and therefore you're more economic when it comes to running economy. And if you take the tools you can use for increasing your running economy, then it lasts from, let's say, running volume, running intensity. Then you are shortly make your way to strength training, plyometrics, and so on and so on. So tons of tools you can use, and all totally different to the other. And I think the main thing is, just for me, that if you want to train running economy, at first you need to know how the running economy already is. Because it's not only when it comes to training a slightly black box, but also when it comes to testing a little bit of a black box, because it's nothing you can easily test on the outside, for example. So if you want to know your threshold on your bike, I mean, take a power meter, do a 20 minutes test, and then you'll have halfway your FTP, whatever that means. But if your FTP increases by 10% in 3 months, then you know, yeah, it's better. Perfect. And your endurance capacity or performance has increased, and then it's fine. But there's no testing method on the outside where you could say, well, I'm running a 5K run all out and then training my running economy with all the tools I named you. And then you'll run the 5Ks again in 2 or 3 months and you see you're 2 minutes faster, but you do not have a single clue whether it's your increased VO2 max, which led to your stronger performance, if there's any changes in your running economy, how probably your anaerobic metabolism has developed throughout the time. And therefore, it still stays within this black box. And even if you would have known that it was running economy which got better, then you probably still do not have a clue if it was the running volume, the intensity, the plyometrics, or the max strength training you added on Tuesdays and Thursdays in your training plan, for example, because you still don't have a clue which one worked best. And therefore, running economy is a perfect example for testing. And then what we all do in training, trial and error, and then test again. And then you see what really helped to increase your running economy. And is it probably a consistency into running kilometers per week? Is it a certain intensity you try out in training? Or did you, after you tried all of this and probably it didn't even work to develop the running economy, added max strength training or added plyometrics? And we can now have hours and hours of discussions about what I think could help in running economy. And honestly, the answer will always be that it comes down to the individual to decide whether plyometrics is a thing, yes or no. Whether, I don't know, running kilometers up to 80 or 100 or 120 kilometers per week is a thing, yes or no. And I can say, for example, let's take Patrick, because we were talking about, it's neither plyometric, it's not running volume, because, I mean, if I would say how many kilometers Patrick is running per week, I think it's somehow impossible to understand why with that small amount of kilometers you can have that outcome. But what I know is working for him is that you have tons of just quality kilometers, well-fueled, let's say, very fine defined intensities, and then a lot of stuff going on next to running itself. So doing a lot of athletic training, stability work, visiting your physiotherapist twice a week, and this and that and this and that. And then, I mean, that's not the only thing, but then it comes down in the race itself. So if you want a 2:30 marathon, you can have whatever running economy you want. If, for example, your carbohydrate oxidation is not going well on your bike ride, then it doesn't work to run a fast marathon. So we could extend it not only from discussing running economy and training, but also to how to race long distance triathlon races to still be able to run a 2:30 marathon. So, I mean, I'll have time, so we can go through.
Let's start with the volume side. So at least last time, I think you mentioned that Patrick ran 50 to 60 kilometers on average per week into Tulsa. Is that the same, similar?
No, absolutely the same. And so I don't know if it's like this year in average 53 or 55 or something, but it will be around that. And I mean, let's do an add-on. We could also discuss what a long run, for example, is. I mean, there are tons of different definitions about a long run in triathlon training, for example. And to add that one, for example, I don't know how many 2-hour runs Patrick has done so far. We could probably ask him in the last 4 years. But I bet maybe 4, 5. And there won't be any in preparation to the 2024 season, I think. Probably 1, but only whenever it's really a thing about having fun, doing something really special, on a training camp, me joining on a bike, having the fuel with me and everything. So it's more for the fun part to, let's say really hop on this or over that barrier of running longer than 1.5 hours. But the typical long run in our definition, or in my definition, is lasts up to 1.5 hours, and then it still be enough. And when we talk about run volume, I mean, what we have to see is not the volume we think in average is the volume we ran, but the volume you can really be 100% sure of that's your average over the whole preparation for the upcoming season, for example. So many people are telling me that they are running like 80 to 100 kilometers per week. And if I ask how often they do that, then, and no offense, but often to the next injury, and then they are ill again or injured again, and then they do it again and do it for 3 weeks, and then there's still a break because probably of any issues they have, and that doesn't make sense. And if I say Patrick is running 50 to 60 Ks per week, then you can take for granted that I can count the days when he really was injured due to any kind of overstressing injuries, not like crashing and breaking his collarbone, for example. But if we really say how often he's gone over that sharp line of nuts where he was not able to stand the training stress anymore, I don't know, like 3 days, 4 days or something, when he really could not train what I put on the menu that day. And that's it. So, and you can't handle, for example, COVID, or you can't handle crashes or any illnesses you get by getting infected of other persons, for example. But if you see really the self-developed illnesses where it's, let's say, I don't want to say fault, but where you've probably overdone it, then you can be 100% sure that his consistency in training is extremely high. And therefore, 50 to 60 kilometers is probably enough if you put enough quality into it to really develop that run performance.
Yeah, it's 3,000 kilometers, 2,500, 3,000 kilometers in a year if you do it 50 weeks of the year. So
That's it.
You can also go and look at your yearly kilometers, and it's easy to do maybe 80 kilometers for 1 or 2 months, but to achieve those higher numbers for a year is more, maybe not more difficult, but it's it's more important. But is this something that you think that for most of your athletes that it's not that you're lower on running volume than, let's say, people think than would be, I don't want to say typical, but is there any of your athletes that you have significantly higher run volume with because that just seems to work well for them, or is it very individual?
I think in the end it's always risk versus reward. So what is the outcome if you, and we're not talking about like 50 compared to, let's say, 65 Ks, because I mean, sure, there's a difference, but there would still be something where I would guess that 65 is still below what you said, like typical what pros are running in triathlon. But the question always is, I mean, what's your risk of taking 80 to 100 kilometers per week, and what's your reward? And in the end, if you are and now we do it the hard way probably, but if you're competing in pro triathlon and you want to be somewhere near the world class level and you're running 80 to 100 Ks per week, but you're not able to guarantee a run below, let's say, the 3 hour, 10 minutes mark on your Ironman distance, then probably ask yourself if the risk of running 100 Ks per week is worth the reward or the outcome of being, I don't want to say slow, but not one of the faster runners. And probably then you can decide if running 20 to 30 Ks less, let's say, and then adding instead whatever you want, what could help you to improve your running performance, is probably more worth than the running kilometers itself. So why aren't we talking about the strength training, the plyometrics, the stability work, the athletic training, this and that could probably help you, or the quality work in running technique if you want to, this and that. And good thing in triathlon is you're always able to measure it and then trial and error again and measure it again and see if it works, yes or no. And that's where I think you do not have there's no, I don't want to say idea behind running 100 or 120 Ks per week, but only if your outcome is that you definitely belong to the fastest runners in the field. If that isn't your outcome, I don't see a sense in there. And if you need 120K to run 3 hours and 10 on your marathon, I don't know if it's really worth then, because what is your potential in development? I mean, what do you want to do? I'm talking about female athletes, actually. Like, I was thinking about 3 hours and 10 minutes in female athletes. So it wasn't something where you could do anything in the male field. But if you really want to develop your performance and come probably closer to the 3 hour mark, I mean, what are your choices you'll have? You can't increase your running kilometers from 100 to 140 or 50 or 160 Ks per week. That doesn't work. And then, honestly, often thinking about risk and reward. And when it comes to running kilometers per week or let's say running volume, then it's one of the things that really exponential higher your risk in getting injured. And then you'll have to really have a close look on how many kilometers you really want to run per week and how many kilometers you really can stand in cases of consistency over the whole season. It's not a problem in cycling kilometers. I mean, if you're riding 25 or 28 or 30 hours per week, we would say, fuel yourself well. It's going to be a long day in the saddle. Sure, you can ride for 6 or 7 hours a day instead of 5, but I mean, I don't see a injury risk in there. But in running, it's completely different. And the risk is getting exponential higher. And therefore, you really have to have a close look on running volume per week and the risk versus reward relationship.
Let's get to the intensity side of things then. So can you explain how you use an intensity here? Is maybe we're not necessarily even talking like anything super intense. Maybe it's slower than Ironman pace, which is still obviously fast for someone like Patrick, especially. But anything that is faster than just an easy jog. How do you work that into the weekly schedule?
Yeah, let's do it in a very simple way. Let's say you have a threshold pace for your running performance, and then I mainly use 3 different kinds of intensities, which is like the normal endurance-based intensity, let's say endurance-based 1, and then you have endurance-based 2, which is still definitely below your threshold, which is up to, let's say, 85 to 95% somehow there of your threshold pace. And then you'll have everything around your threshold, let's say 95 to whatever, 105% of your threshold pace, for example. And these are the 3 main intensities I'm using in training. And then you can have a lot of variety how you want to use it. For sure, an endurance-based 1 run is different if it lasts for 1 hour or for 2 hours, or if it's a brick run, yes or no, or if it's on your whatever 5th or 6th day of your training block, or on your 1st day of your training block. And these are the 3 main intensities. Very rare, I would say, it becomes even more intensive, and we would really talk about high intensive training. But then the question is again, what is risk versus reward? Because running whatever 200-meter intervals, 400-meter intervals, I mean, great, fun in training, absolutely good. But I do not really very often see the possibility within a 30 or 35 hour week of training to be 100% confident that I can now write down, let's say 10, 15 times 400-meter intervals and still be sure that the athlete can stand this, let's say, stress, whatever that means, whether it's training stress or a biomechanical stress or whatsoever. So we just call it stress. And therefore, it does not really have to happen pretty often. especially in combination with the other intensities you have in swimming and biking for sure. And then athletic training, which is, will name it today because I think triathlon has minimum 4 disciplines in training. And therefore, these 3 main intensities, and also pretty rare is just the only endurance-based one run. So there's nearly always intensity in there, which is not only your endurance-based intensity, but minimum somewhere around, let's say, 80% of your threshold, or threshold training, for example, for, let's say, 3, 4, 5 times 800 meters, 1,000 meters, whatever you want, 1,500 meters, depending on which state of the season you are, how you want to develop your VO2 max in cases of intensity training, for example. And this and that. And therefore, these 3 intensities packed in a schedule where you can say that there are maximum 5 runs per week. And that's really a lot. I normally only use 4. And then it's always about the context of training and also about run training. So context for me means what's the idea behind this run? So what is your goal for that one? Why are you doing it? And then the context is what stuff you are doing around. Same example, if you're having an intensive 3.5 hour ride before your run in the afternoon, the run definitely will have a different idea than running it isolated after breakfast, for example. So not like a different idea. It's not like there's 100% change in the idea behind, but the adaptation you'll have from it, the stress you're producing, let's say, and then probably the outcome will definitely be different. And therefore you'll always have to take into account how the context looks like. Let's do again the long run. I don't care for the duration of a single run if you're not telling me the context of your run block, for example. You can run Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for, let's say, every day 1.5 hours, and do it on Friday pretty intensive with a lot of threshold intervals. Running it on Saturday with, let's say, 4 times 15 minutes in endurance-based 2 zone. And then running your long run on Sunday, which is only 1.5 hours long. But in that context of these 2 workouts, run workouts you had on Friday and Saturday, your run on Sunday will have a completely different training stress, training outcome, adaptation, and everything. And that's what, in my opinion, we'll have to consider if we are discussing, for example, the long run, whatever that is. I don't really see a sense in discussing the duration of a single run.
Can you explain the endurance-based 2 intensity in terms of physiology or performance markers? Is it like your Ironman race pace, your LT1, or where is it roughly?
More or less, yeah. And there's still, I mean, I'm a fan of bigger ranges for these training zones. Like I said, if we are talking about, I don't know how exactly I have it on the training platform, but I would guess something like 83 to 95, for example, percentage. And I mean, it's a completely different intensity if we talk about 83% of your 3-minute per kilometer pace on your threshold, or if it's like 94% or 95%. So therefore, there's already a difference in a single training zone. And then it's a lot about education and trust and the let's say the talks behind that your athlete is still able to decide on his own when he feels a little bit more fatigue, that he can also run at 85% of that training zone and he's still going well. And he still is going for the goal you set for him, probably, or for her. And that at first, I mean, the variety is pretty big. And then I would guess, that's why I'm doing it, that a higher intensity always brings a higher VO2 you'll need for it with it. So therefore, there will be adaptations in your VO2 max. And if it's race pace or not, I mean, on the first hand, I do not really care. I'm just caring about the physiological response of that training workout, probably the training context, the week, the block, the whatever, whole preparation over months, whatever you want. And then the aim is to build a physiological profile where you can say now the athlete is able to, is at the peak of his performance capacity, let's say. And what you need for this is, for example, in running, a good running economy, a high VO2 max, and probably a low anaerobic system. So, and then the endurance base 2, probably we can call it zone 2. And now you'll have more clicks on your podcast because we used a trendy training zone, which I'm still impressed that we can use a training zone as an idea of a training method, for example, which I do not get. For me, training zones are just a thing which I use to better describe in which intensity they should run. But the idea behind is not like running in zone 2, but hiring your VO2 max and therefore spend 20 to 30% of your time in zone 2, for example. But anyway, so it's a thing where I think the development of, for example, your running economy is going really well. You'll spend a lot of time of your running 50, 60 Ks per week with a really good intensity, not too low, not too high. You can stand it for quite a long time without being afraid of risking any injuries. You normally won't get injured in a, let's say, zone 2 run, for example, or partly zone 2 run. And then hopefully the athlete develops physiologically in the way you want him to develop, and then it works. But honestly, we could also say, or any criticism is more than welcome, saying that you just need half of these zone 2 runs and could add more threshold intervals. And I would still say the same about that. Sure, the development of your VO2 max is probably even better when you do more threshold runs. But then again, it's a risk versus reward thing. How often can you do threshold runs? How well recovered do you need to be for it? What ride did you do before? What swim did you do before? What have you planned for the rest of the day? So yeah, pretty in the end, always individual.
So it's not about those any specific adaptations to those intensities, but it's more about finding a right balance of load. You can do more work in the endurance base 2 versus threshold, but you want a bit of both, but finding the right balance so that you're not taking too much risk, I guess.
Yeah, and if we are talking about the familiarization in that at that intensity, I mean, what we need to say is whenever we do running economy testings, then it's pretty clear that the time you spend at that intensity will definitely help. Let's take the typical example, the classic marathon runner. I don't know if it's still like that today, but 10, 15, 20 years ago, the typical marathon runner spent his whole time in his comfort zone while training. So they didn't do any 200-meter intervals, 400-meter intervals whatsoever, but just set on running volume, feel good intensity, but not a huge variety of intensities, and probably not even caring for different type of training zones, but just going out for a run. Perfect. The outcome when it comes to running economy was pretty often that their running economy in their comfort zone, let's say, is great. So 100% really good. And they are more than economical at that intensity. But as far they are going slightly more intensive, probably trying to run at their threshold, you could directly see how running economy totally crashed down, and they were really having, I don't want to be too harsh, but shitty running economies compared to their running economy, which was great, right, while running in their comfort zone. Reason for that, I mean, if we take all the neuromuscular things, the coordination you'll have while running that intensity or this intensity, the whole probably economical work your respiratory system is doing at that intensity, your capability of the clearance of lactate while running at threshold intensity, for example, all of that definitely will be something which needs time spent in that zone to really do it good. You can't do plyometrics and then hope for having a good running economy at threshold intensity without running at threshold intensity. You'll need to do them all, let's say. And therefore, I guess a side effect from running in, let's say, zone 2 again, is that it comes really close to whatever intensity you want to have in a race, whether it's lower zone 2 intensity and we talk about Ironman pace, whether it's a little bit probably the upper range of zone 2 and you're running at 70.3 intensity, for example. And that will definitely be a thing which can help, but it's not the main goal of running there.
And so just a final point on this topic about the intensity distribution, then if we take the example of Patrick, around 55 kilometers a week, how many kilometers, roughly speaking, would be zone 2 and how many would be threshold and how many would be just endurance?
You mean in percentage?
Kilometers, if we know that he's running about 55 kilometers, so would he be doing 15 kilometers threshold, 20 zone 2, 25 zone 2?
So let's say taking the typical actual training week, and I can probably open it next to talking about it, but I would say if we just take the percentages or the kilometers, then I'm not 100% sure if it really paints the right picture of the idea behind. If we take just 4 runs, let's say, and if we start with giving these runs main goals, then minimum one of these runs actually is a run where you have a certain amount of threshold intervals in it. Like, let's say 4 times 1,000 meters at 3 minutes pace, for example. And then we could say that 25% of all runs are having the aim of hiring his VO2 max, for example, and therefore partly running at threshold. If we would see the whole run, I mean, then it was a 1.5 hour run. He did like 23 Ks and ran 4 Ks at threshold, 19 Ks just endurance based. I mean, that's already like, what is it like? Probably 20% in that run, 15% in that run where he was running at threshold pace. Compared to the whole week, it's, I don't know, 5%, 4, 3, slightly nothing. And therefore, I'm saying that probably the main goal of the run itself can help out. I mean, sure, we can also say that the rest of that run is probably not with the main goal of hiring his VO2 max, because it's just an endurance-based run. But if we take the run itself, then we can say also 1.5 hours of running will help your VO2 max, because it is running volume, running intensity, and therefore you'll need VO2 to also run at his like easy pace at 350, for example. It's still a high amount of VO2 you'll need also for the rest beside the threshold intervals. And then the question would be, what more can we do in one run to very specifically work on his VO2 max? And then I think, I mean, he did that now 3-4 times. 4 times 1,000 meters is already minimum good when it comes to my range of planning it. So I would never write down 8 times 2,000 meters, let's say. But I think the risk of the workout is still totally fine. His feedback is going well. Therefore, we will increase it up to 6 times, whatever, 8 times, probably 1,000 meters, and then it's fine. And then, but that's it. It won't be even longer, because I think then we are losing the risk versus reward game. And therefore, one run threshold intervals, minimum 2 of it picked with whatever we'll have in zone 2, whether it's like 3 times 8 minutes, 4 times 12 minutes, for example. Then also probably a variety in there. I love playing in these zones, like writing down, run the first 10 Ks in the middle, then the next, 10 minutes in the middle, then the next 10 minutes at the upper range, and then the next 10 minutes, for example, at the lower range. And then a single run, which is just the typical endurance-based run without any intensities. Sometimes a little bit of acceleration in there, probably, if you want to. So if you want to bring the athlete out of this comfort zone of probably also risking that he's too much into losing the concentration and the neuromuscular activation and everything, you can add like little run accelerations up to like 6 to 8 seconds, for example, twice, 3 times, 4 times within a run. But always be careful. I mean, an acceleration or somehow a sprint or something is always, again, the risk versus reward question. That's nothing I would do at the end of a 5 or 6 day training block, probably, where you already are in hour, 34 of your week. Then it could probably be a bit too much.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That makes sense and gives good context. And then the final part, so the plyometrics and athletics training, just speaking generally, what things are you using that you think works well in general, and then maybe some specifics, what have you found for Patrick that works well for him and does not work well for him?
I'm in the pretty luxury situation, to be honest, because I know the times before when I wasn't, that all of them have their physiotherapist next to them. So, and then it's always a close communication between the physiotherapist, probably also the nutritionist, whatever they have already. And then you can really make it individual about disbalances, potentials here, potentials there. And then it's about, let's say, activating your glutes for your run, for example, working on your core for not only running economy, but also for probably your stable bike position you'll have on your TT bike, for example, and this and that. And now it's tons of things you can add in training. Just as an overview, I would say that 4 times an hour, 4 times up to 1.5 hours minimum is planned for whatever we call athletic training now. But really training, not like the hour massage at your physiotherapist, that's extra. But really like, let's say 4 hours, which would mean probably around 15% of your total training time is spent doing whatever you can call athletic training. Sometimes it's strength training, and they do maximum strength training with their physiotherapist and whatever, using the bench press or doing squats or whatsoever. And then we won't call it athletic training. That's why I said it in like, yeah, that's my overall definition of, let's say, off-bike training is what we would call it in cycling. Whatever you do which is not on your bike. And therefore, when I say athletic training, it would mean whatever you do which is not swim, bike, and run. And and therefore it needs to have a proper priority in your training. Because, I mean, if you take just your upper core as an example, you'll find tons of reasons why it helps you for swimming, for biking, and for running. And therefore you train, whenever you train your core, you're training swim, bike, and run, but just from a different point of view. And therefore it totally makes sense to do it. And it's the same for running economy. Let's do the example again, just to link it. If you train your core, it can help your initial running economy to get better, because you're not losing too much energy for your run just to run your pace due to your pretty weak upper core. And if you have a weak core, then we can halfway imagine, if it's already weak and you can test that it impacts your running economy, I mean, what potentially could happen after a 180k ride where your weak core is sitting in aero position with a pretty close hip angle, and then you'll have to open it up and stand there and run totally straight with a potentially good running economy. That won't happen. Your running economy will get worse and worse with every biking hour and with every kilometer in the run. And in the end, you're probably 10 centimeters smaller than you've been at the start line. So therefore, that doesn't make sense. And therefore, there has to be a priority to also train that one.
What do you do if you're not in the luxurious situation of the athletes working with their own physiotherapist?
And that's why absolutely, and that's why I'm saying it. And I know that from older times, training like whatever 30, 40, 50 age group athletes. And then at least, I mean, there were times when, so what I used, it's like 10 years, 15 years ago. So it wasn't like Instagram, and watching Instagram videos about TRX videos or something wasn't a big thing. Because at least I didn't have Instagram. I don't know when it came up, to be honest. But what I used at the beginning was every core stuff, for example, you could get from the Mark Verstegen group. There was the first things where you could say, buy yourself this book, take workout number, whatever, 2, 5, and 7, and I'll put on your training plan that you please do it every Monday and Wednesday and Friday afternoon, for example. And then there was at least a plan, a very general one, surely not having an eye on the way they were doing it, because I couldn't stand next to them, not having an idea if it really helps with any disbalances, for example, whatever, in their hip. And therefore, I mean, sure, in the end, there has to be a general way. And I'm, for example, a big fan of TRX bands. So in my opinion, they really can help you. You can travel with them. Also, as an age group athlete, you do not have an excuse if there's no gym in your hotel while you're on your business trip or whatsoever. And then they are, I mean, now it's way easier. You can Google it. You can go on Instagram and do stuff that makes sense on Instagram, not like just scrolling, but I mean, finding yourself some good TRX workouts, for example, you could do that strengthen your upper body. And in the end, don't make it too complicated, even if you're not 100% sure if it really helps your disbalances, like I said it now. And even if you can't say you're in a luxury situation, it always makes sense to spend 3 times 20 minutes with your TRX or doing core performance workouts or this and that. And I mean, then in the end, I would say it also makes sense to visit a physiotherapist regularly, because he's the one or she's the one who can tell you where your potential disbalances are, and then you can adapt it or have a chat with your coach saying, well, whatever, my right hip is stiffer than my left one, for example, and then you can still decide if you want to adapt your program, for example. But I mean, first thing, it should have a higher priority in your total training. And then, I mean, core training, strength training, for example, is a thing I wouldn't recommend for everyone. If you really want to have some good squats, even if it's, especially when it's like maximum strength training, then you'll have to be really good educated in doing squats. You'll have to make your way up to the point where you could really say, now I'm using the big weights, for example. And then normally there has to be someone around watching you and correcting your movements. And this is something I would never recommend for everyone, especially because I do not see the risk versus reward approach in there. Maximum strength training won't make you that faster, that it's really worth risking any injuries by doing it wrong, for example. And therefore, core, TRX. You could also do yoga, for example. If yoga is the thing for you and you like to do it 3 times a week, and then it's perfect.
So let's say you have an age grouper, you can't see them, they don't necessarily have a physiotherapist that they go to. You can choose between these 4 things. So core, including TRX and stuff, plyometrics, weight training, so heavy weights, maximum strength work, and number 4, mobility, including things like yoga. How would you rank them? What would be the most important to least important of those 4?
1 is number 1. So the core.
4, yeah.
4, the mobility is number 2, and forget the rest.
Okay, forget
we'll make it very general now.
Yep.
So really don't. I mean, the problem in triathlon is you can do everything way more complicated than it is. And if we would have all 4, sorry, then we would by now also have a discussion about when to implement strength training into your training rhythm. Because it's not a thing where you can say you can do it on every day, no matter if you train 5 hours before on that day or not. which you can definitely do for core training and mobility. So no problem at all. But strength training needs to be really having a massive priority into thinking about how your training schedule will look like. And therefore, I wouldn't make it too complicated. I would definitely pick core training at first, mobility second, so that you do not get one of these very stiff people due to your cyclic way of training swim, bike, and running. And then that's it. And then do it. You can combine it. You can have an hour where you can do 45 minutes of core training and 15 minutes of mobility, for example, or a bit of yoga work. And if you then do it like, depending on the duration of one single workout, but 2 to 4 times a week, perfect. You can also do it like 4 times 20 minutes, and it's definitely lots better than doing nothing.
Yeah, perfect. So we're an hour into the interview and we have covered 2 questions. I will have to skip some of them probably.
Yeah, you only had like 12 or something, so
yes.
It's going to be a long one.
Yes, it's going to be a long one. I will ask the next one and then maybe start skipping some. But in general terms, now we have discussed a lot about how to distribute the intensity in running. So we covered that. What about swimming and cycling? Can you discuss through your philosophy on how to distribute volume and intensity in swimming and cycling in a triathlon context?
By the way, we can also do a second episode if you want to, so we do not need to skip the very good questions from your followers, for example. Just to say that. Honestly, I do only very rare care for distributions of whether it's volume or intensity, especially not by comparing the 3 disciplines. So if you would ask me how many hours Patrick is spending per week, let's say, with swim, bike, and run, then I would really need to think about it because I can't say it just on purpose. But when I'm sitting there, like we all do, writing a training plan, then there are some fixed points in the plan where I think this has to be a mandatory part of a professional triathlete's training plan. Like, for example, beginning with the most important one, a rest day. Yeah. So there has to be a rest day in there where I can be sure that from that day on, he's way better recovered. So I can put a lot more what we would call quality into training than I could before. And when I talk about quality, I mean whatever you have, strength endurance training, threshold sessions, zone 2, and so on and so on. So therefore, recovery day is always mandatory, which could mean that you still do an hour of easy riding, like an active recovery ride, for example. You could also go swimming for half an hour just for like 2Ks or 2.5Ks or something. But the definition of a recovery day is that in the morning of the day after, you feel way better than on the morning of your recovery day. Okay? And whatever you need in between that helps you to feel better on the next day is great. You can do nothing. You can go for an active recovery ride, or you can go for an easy swim, and therefore you'll more or less decide what feels better for you. So, and then mandatory is also that there is a certain volume in there in all 3 disciplines, which would mean for swimming, for example, that you'll need to have 4 to 5 workouts minimum that should be in your plan. 4 is fine if there's a bit of traveling here and there, or if there's a training week and then the recovery week starts right on Thursday, and therefore in addition to that, it's not 5 swimming sessions per week, but normally I would say 5 is the number that has to be in your plan. And then if we take 5 swimming sessions and we do it a little bit more general now, then, I mean, if you just take the volume of a single workout, it starts at, let's say, 4Ks, for example, somewhere near there. It does not really make sense to hop into the water for 3Ks. So therefore, it's like 4 to probably 5.5, the really long ones. Let's say, 4.5 in average, multiplied with 5. So we talk about 20 to 25 kilometers of swimming per week. Just the volume. If you then see the intensity in there, I mean, again, a whole big variety of from threshold to high intensity, from going long in endurance-based zone 1, for example, and all of that. And then for biking, it's more or less the same way of acting. Like you having the training plan, you already have a rest day and 5 days where you are swimming in there. And sure, you won't count the ride on rest day as a training ride, let's say. But then, yeah, depending on whether there is a second potential rest day in there, if not, yeah, then it's like 6 days of riding normally. 'Cause I like the bike part of the training plan pretty much, because it can still help to make even the 4th or 5th day in a row better than you'll had it before. Let's do an example. If you have 3 sessions in a row, like training on, we do the normal week, Monday's rest day, let's say. And if you have an intensive or halfway intensive session on Tuesday, I'm not a big fan of the intensive ones right after the rest day, because they will never feel great. Yeah, it's like the rest day at the Tour de France. You won't have a great stage right after the rest day if you are not going for a 2.5 hour ride on your rest day. And then halfway intensive, the most intensive one on Wednesday then, and then probably a less intensive one on Thursday. And then you can, for example, decide if you on Friday want to have a long endurance-based ride, or if you just say it's, let's say, an hour and a half of easy riding, because the main focus on that day is on swimming in the morning, then probably the ride, and then the run in the afternoon, and the run gets a focus. I mean, every day in a training plan needs to have at least a little bit of focus in there. And then the focus is probably the run. And sometimes, depending on actually where you live, where you are, a 1.5 hour easy ride, good weather can help to recover a bit better, to warm up, let's say, already for the run. And then you're having the run after. And therefore, the bike session is not really the training session for your, let's say, bike VO2 max, if we want to call it like that, but more to prepare yourself well for the upcoming run in the afternoon, for example. And then, I mean, let's describe it in general, or continue describing it in general. Then you can continue on Saturday and Sunday again with having 2 rides. And if you are having an easier ride on Friday, for example, you can again increase the intensity for Saturday and Sunday. Different approach would be like in training camp, for example, more or less doing the first 2 days same, and then having long endurance-based rides on the next, for example, 2 or 3 days in a row coming up on training day 3, 4, and 5. And if the athletes are at home, then I'm normally a fan of having the fixed rest day in your schedule so that you can plan with it. So that you know, I'm going to the physiotherapist on my rest day. I'm having 2-3 appointments with media and sponsors. Whatever you do, I'm pre-cooking for the rest of the week, for example, on my rest day. When they are on training camp, then I only think in 3, 4, or 5 day blocks of training. So then there's no fixed rest day on Mondays, for example, but you're having, depending on how well performing, how good their performance capacity already is, that they are having 3 probably at the beginning days blocks, and then 4 or 5 days blocks. And if you have a 5-day block, I mean, then it's slightly or mid-intensive on the first day, let's say high intensive, or the main intensive ride on the second day, and then probably some strength endurance on your 3rd day, and endurance-based rides on your 4th and 5th day, for example.
Couple follow-up questions. Or first of all, yes, let's split this into, let's do, I have time until 12 o'clock, so 1 o'clock your time, so we have another 43 minutes, so let's keep going, answer as many questions as we can. But yes, a follow-up question on the rest day. So would you say is an hour easy riding, is that the maximum that you would do on a rest day, or are some athletes they want to do like 2 hours easy riding, or
which is totally fine. I mean, as long as the rule is kept that you need to feel better on your next morning, then everything is fine. And honestly, concerning bike rides, I absolutely do not worry. You can also do a 2.5 hour ride or a 3 hour ride if you fuel yourself well, if you restore your carbohydrates, for example, and everything. And if the weather is great, because it's whatever, a sunny ride at 20 degrees, so nothing to risk there concerning illnesses and everything, then I'm absolutely not worried. I would be worried if the athlete would ask me if he could run on a rest day, yes or no. And I don't care if it's a 20 minutes easy run or an hour easy run. I would also be worried at the 20 minutes run, because I always think that running, due to the impact you have of accelerating your own body weight, and that from step to step, can never be a recovery workout. There's always impact in there, biomechanical wise, physical wise. And therefore, I wouldn't see it as a recovery activity. And therefore, whatever you want to do on your ride, feel free to do it, as long as you feel better the next day after. But don't go for a run.
Okay, makes sense. And then secondly, so can you discuss how you choose which intensity is a bit to work on within swimming and cycling? So when do you work on high intensity in swimming, threshold, and in the bike? How do you choose between something like zone 2, threshold, strength, endurance, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's all about the different physiological profiles you have in all three disciplines. And then if you see your physiological profile, and in swimming, for example, more or less like in running, it depends on your VO2 max, probably on your anaerobic metabolism, and also on your, let's call it, economy. Yeah. Whatever that means in swimming, whatever that means in running. Completely different, sure, and definitely different tools you need in training to get a better economy in swimming than in running. So you won't do whatever max strength training for your shoulders to increase your swimming economy, probably. Different to maybe doing squats in running. But in the end, every discipline has its physiological profile, and then you need to find out which discipline has its main potential in which physiological parameter. Is it in cycling? Is your anaerobic threshold, or your FTP, however we want to call it, your maximum lactate steady state, at, let's do 330 watts by 65 kilograms. Is it limited due to what? Is it your missing VO2 max because it's only 75 and not 85 or 95, for example? Or is it due to your too high anaerobic metabolism? And you can ask the same questions for running and for swimming. And in the end, I mean, the athletes are not machines. They won't adapt for every parameter in the same way. So the question is how to find out which works better. Example in running, probably running economy increasing. I mean, we had that. Let's do a different example. VO2 max in biking. You'll find out that the VO2 max is too low, and that's your main potential you have to increase the endurance capacity of the athlete. Then the only thing you need to do is to find out what works best for increasing your VO2 max. Is it high intensity? Is it threshold intensity? Is it zone 2? Is it just volume in endurance-based intensity? We can skip the last one. That doesn't work. So we definitely need intensity. And then it's always a distribution about intensity and volume, and how high you want to have the intensity and how often you want to have this intensity. And I'm a fan of, like I said, for also the running, for example, and in riding, I'll definitely put the fourth intensity zone up on the threshold zone. So there's definitely a high intensive zone I'm using regularly, because in cycling, it has way less to do with risking any injuries, because you won't have the impact of a 400-meter run on your track when you are doing high intensity rides on your bike. So biomechanically, it's way easier to do than whatever you could do in high intensity stuff for the run. And and then I'm a fan of doing intensities in training in a halfway recovered state. So not like having 3 endurance-based rides up to 4 to 5 hours, and then on day 4 doing the intensities, because I think, I mean, not like I've proven it a lot of times, but I think being well recovered helps to adapt. So when you then put the threshold intervals or the high intensity intervals on your, let's say, second or third day of the training block, then I would think that the adaptation or the outcome from it, the physiological outcome, will be better when you do it halfway recovered and you still have a good option to adapt from it instead of doing it on a very fatigued state. On the other hand, let's get away from the VO2 max, but if your anaerobic system, or let's say the metabolism, which uses carbohydrates to produce energy, you can't produce it, but to convert it into the energy you need for running and cycling and swimming, is pretty high, and you probably want to lower it, which means you are aiming for your body using less carbohydrates and therefore more fats for performing. Then I would think that day 4 and 5 specifically in such a training block are getting a pretty high priority, because we are already talking about the fact that your glycogen stores, for example, will definitely be slightly depleted on day 4 or 5, because at some point you can't restore them every day by 100%. You can't train 6-7 hours and be 100% sure that next day they are still on 100% level. And therefore, for example, lowering anaerobic metabolism, it could definitely be helpful to do them not on day 1, 2, 3, but probably on day 4 or 5, because you've already done some pre-work while having intensity in your rides, for example, and therefore start your trainings with lower glycogen levels, for example, and then having a better adaptation to your anaerobic metabolism.
Do you ever do that intentionally, not just as the part of not just as a sequence of the training block, but actually having let's say an intense ride with limited carbohydrate intake and then doing a ride the next morning fasted? Is that something you ever do?
I did that pretty often years ago when I coached athletes with just a normal amount of training hours available per week. So if we would talk about a triathlete who wants to do a long distance race, for example, and has, let's say, 10 hours per week, 2 hours on every training day, 2 rest days, just very general, then I would definitely consider it, or that's what I did. And pretty often that, for example, on Wednesday evening, there was an intensive ride for 1.5 hours. Next morning, it was an easy ride, but with pre-breakfast, for example, so that the glycogen stores are already halfway depleted. And then I definitely did it. Now, not a single session. So I don't know when I last time wrote down that I want to have a low-carb ride or low-carb run or whatsoever in professional triathlon, because when you are training 35 hours per week, it unwillingly develops that at some point you are training with low glycogen stores halfway. Whether it's on your 4th or 5th day in a row, whether it's the 3rd workout on that day. I mean, if you're having a swim session in the mornings, you're swimming 5Ks, then having breakfast, you hopefully had a snack in the morning before swimming, and then huge breakfast, and then you go for a 4.5 hour ride, having lunch, then a nap, and then go for a run, that glycogen stores won't ever be at 100%. I'm highly sure that doesn't happen. And therefore, nearly every run in the afternoon has to do with, let's say, at least not full glycogen stores, wherever they are. I mean, nobody knows, as we sadly can't measure them. Whenever there's a measuring technique, I will be the first one to use it, except biopsies. in training. That doesn't make sense. I mean, that definitely lowers your training hours available. So therefore, always depending on the training hours you have per week. In cycling, I would definitely use it more often because it's more direct and the risk is not high, especially because you're not running and therefore you do not have any running impact. So there's also no risk of, let's say, a limited energy availability, for example, and therefore a potential state of risking injuries due to missing energy availability and therefore bone density, for example. In cycling, I would definitely use it more often, but for pro triathlon, not a single session this year, for example.
And onto a different topic and question. How do you approach tapering for races?
That's a good question because honestly, I haven't yet 100% fixed way how to do it, because depending on travel time, jet lag, circumstances at the race venue, for example, media appointments, then the schedule itself. Let's do an example. If you are racing the PTO race in Ibiza as a woman and you had the World Championships in Nice exactly the week before, then tapering will look different than you could when you prepare it without having a race, for example, before. So therefore, it's different. It's individual, the classical university answer. And with more and more time, honestly, in pro triathlon, I'm getting more and more a fan of not lowering volume and intensity too much ahead of the race. So sure, there has to be a point where you can say that all your work and training needs to now have time to adapt and your body needs to recover until we do the activation again. So, I mean, the main keys of tapering: recover, activate, or adapt and activate, probably. But I'm more and more a fan of finding a way where they do have a chance to recover pretty well, probably still at home and not having this training until Friday. The flight is going on Sunday. But already be at least a little bit recovered on the, let's say, 2 last days at home. So training there, but not the big training days. And then staying into the training rhythm is a thing I think it's pretty important, because just my thought about it is that if you're a pro triathlete, you're used to the training and you can deal with 15 hours of training a week. And 15 hours is more like, depending on how you do it, but more like active recovery compared to your 35 hours training weeks. And therefore, I think it totally makes sense to stay into the rhythm, to keep the metabolism running, to keep the energy expenditure high, to minimum twice a day, get your whole respiratory system running for minimum an hour per session. And therefore, I would say that a normal week leading up to race day on Saturday or Sunday wouldn't look like a typical taper week for someone outstanding looking on it. Always fixed is still a day, let's say 2 or 3 days ahead of the race, which is really, really relaxing. Probably only the 45 minutes easy riding, jumping into the water, going 1.5 Ks easy. And then the activation the day after, probably 2 days of activating. So still the halfway intensive ride for 1.5 hours and the brick run for 30 minutes after, and then going into the race.
What day? So the activation day that you described there, is that the day before the race, or the 2 days before the race?
Yeah. So normally it's just 1 day, as I think it's halfway enough, but it depends a little bit how relaxing the last rest day, let's say, or active recovery day was. And then it also depends a lot on, for example, how your media schedule looks like. I mean, if we are, for example, having a tapering phase ahead of the Kona race, then you'll always have to consider that you have press conferences, you have briefings, you have media appointments, which has to do with, a lot of cognitive work also, probably a lot of walking from venue 1 to 2 to 3. And then also a lot of standing around, sitting around, and this and that. And sometimes maybe it makes more sense to have 2 days of activating again. But then the first day can be just a normal 2.5 hour ride, just a normal, 3K swim, just a normal training day, like you would do on every start of a training day, a training block after a rest day. So the first day of training, like I said before, is never the day with the most intensity in there, but a day where you do a little bit of everything. So swim, bike, and run normally. But none of these has to do with high intensity, for example. A bit of zone 2 work, maybe a bit of threshold work, but not like the main sessions when it comes to intensity. And like that, and then probably the day before, and when I talk about activation, I would say that what you definitely want to have is the whole metabolism running, the whole respiratory system running. So you need intensity on the day before, which goes to the whole claviature of intensities, not like high intensity, but there will definitely be some threshold intervals in that session on the day before the race. You will probably do, let's say, 3 times 3 minutes at threshold intensity, going half an hour easy, and then be back at home, running shoes on, half an hour of running. Also in there, 2 times, let's say, 5 to 6 minutes of race pace, for example, in there. And then the activation is over.
Got it. And heat preparation, what is your approach to that? For we have a lot of hot races these days, so it's becoming more and more a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the good thing is, the more often you'll have them, the easier you get used to it. It's different for being in mid of Europe, being the white, skinny color type, not skinny, white skin type of person, and then you'll need to go to Las Vegas, for example, and you're competing at 45 degrees. And I think the more often you'll have them, the better it is. And main approach of it would be there early enough. So that's what I always say when it comes. I mean, we had the classic one, like the Kona preparation, where it's halfway hot but mainly humid. And honestly, I would always recommend being there minimum, let's say, 10 to 12 days earlier, plus spending time in your last training camp somewhere in heat conditions minimum. So, like we did it the last years, training camp in Texas, in the woodlands, for example, where it's already very hot, and then hopping over to Kona, not having the big jet lag problems because it's only like, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours, probably something like that, time difference or time gap. And then you are already used to the heat. And the only thing you need now to do in the next 10 days is mainly to adapt to the humidity. And then it's going okay. But honestly, I'm never using any kind of hot water emergencies or any type of training in the sauna or something, because I always think that you will never manage to really 100% fit the conditions you'll have on your race location. So, I mean, if you're in Kona, then again, hot and humid. Sure, in your sauna, it's hot and humid, but you won't have the impact of the sun, for example, which is extremely important to stay on the sunny side of life in training, whether it's on the Canarian Islands or even if you have hot summer in Germany, for example, then it's still better than just staying indoor without having the impact of the sun, and then get your first sunburn on race day, for example. That is definitely a thing I would avoid.
Mm. And do you ever use things like overdressed treadmill or indoor cycling to get the temperature up for an hour?
Nope, never. To be honest, never. I mean, we are talking, and again, probably the luxury situation of training pro athletes who by now are on Fuerteventura in 30 degrees, for example. So they are used to heat conditions from January, February on, and then they will stay on Mallorca or in Texas and this and that. So therefore, they are spending way more time in the heat than they are spending at their home in mid-Europe, where I'm sadly need to sit now at 6 degrees and rain, for example. So therefore, I'm absolutely not worried about the heat. What I would have an eye on is that whenever they are at their race venue, for example, like Kona again, that you bring a little bit of sense in there how often and how long they stay in the heat and in the humid conditions. So probably training at first more in the early mornings where it's not that hot and humid, or in the afternoons probably, and then more and more get used to training in the conditions you will have on race day. And that means mid of the day, hottest time, most humid time, and you'll have to run your marathon at whatever 3:30 pace, for example. And I think best case is just to do it, and just to get get a good feeling and a good familiarization of the conditions you'll have on your race location.
Right. Yep. And a couple of general coaching questions. First, can you give an example of a training or performance related question that you've been thinking about recently and trying to understand better or optimize in some way?
So for my own, you mean?
Yeah, for you.
100%. Tons of. As I'm always a big fan that, it's sports science or training science, and there's still a lot of development in there. And what I often discuss is, for example, or in general first, how fluid certain metrics are while competing out there. Let's take the simplest one. I mean, it's easy to measure your heart rate and see how your heart rate is going while having a race. And you can also do it compared to your power output, for example. So far, so fine. You can now easily measure your, for example, sweat rates or body core temperature, and you could measure it for 8 hours, and you can have time on your x-axis, body core temperature on your y-axis, and then see if there's any difference in there, if, for example, your body temperature is higher while running compared to cycling, whatsoever. Absolutely great, makes totally sense. And then there are hundreds of metrics. I would like to know how they develop over time, but there's a lack of, for example, measuring techniques so far, and therefore I can't. Let's take probably lactate values, but honestly, I think it's a pretty boring one, to be honest, because I think in long distance triathlon, it won't be a limiting factor. So you will always find concentrations that are pretty low. You will never have any concentrations up of, let's say, 4 or 5 millimoles or something. But lactate values, for example, would definitely be a thing if I would be in professional cycling to have an eye on. But then, and we discussed it before, is how well equipped are your glycogen stores? We do not have a single clue about, when we talk about low carb training, like we said it before, the pre-breakfast ride, for example, or the fasted state after an intensive session on Wednesday, and then the session on Thursday morning, where I say, do it please in a low carb state, without having a single clue if your glycogen stores are full up to, let's say, 50%, 60%, 70%, or 80%, or 30%, I don't know. And the next question after it would be if the adaptation to the storage percentages of your glycogen stores make a difference, whether they are a little bit more full or a little bit less full, for example. Is the adaptation different to the pre-breakfast ride when you have 70% of your glycogen stores compared to 35% of your glycogen stores? We do not know. And therefore, that would be a thing where I'm really into it. A lot of carbohydrate stores, carbohydrate oxidation rates is the next thing. We are discussing whether 90 versus 120 grams per hour is better, but nearly none of us knows how it is for the individual athlete and how the oxidation rate, so the carbohydrates you really not only eat without getting gut issues, for example, but you really oxidate, are looking like. And therefore, tons of questions. We can have an own podcast episode about it, about the future of sports science. Not that I know that, but just that I would throw in some questions I would really like to know, because we are definitely, it feels like we're not even in the middle. So therefore, I think there's still a lot of work to do and stuff to get to know, so that we can make it even more scientific.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there something within triathlon or training that triathlon lore that annoys you? For example, you read social media posts where people recommend doing X, Y, Z, and you just want to tear your hair out.
Honestly, I'm not the one scrolling through social media, or even if, then it doesn't have to do with triathlon normally, because there needs to be a time in life that hasn't to do with swim, bike, and run. But I absolutely know what you mean, and I think the long run discussion, for example, I had that before, is a thing which I contextual do not get. So why are we discussing the duration of a single workout or single run? And then I often have the feeling, especially when it comes to long runs, that it's some kind of philosophy war I'm into. So some are saying that it's 30 Ks, where I always say that it's just the typical 2-hour run for Patrick, for example, and even an easy one, for example. On the other hand, there are people talking about 3 hours and 2.5, and you need to do this too. And this is something I do not really get, why a single session. And I'm always asking the question, what physiologically, mentally, biomechanically, whatever you want to have, happens within this session, which is so essentially important that you can't skip it. And I do not really get a satisfying answer on this, to be honest. I mean, I know why training volume makes sense, but then we are talking about consistency of volume per block, per day, per week, per whatever training period. I don't know, but not from a single session. Same is, I often have the feeling that we are, especially in long distance triathlon, doing it a little bit too heroic when we talk about our training volumes. And when thinking about that, the next one and the next one needs to even train more and longer and with higher intensity, and 50% of your training time in the sauna, indoor, and this and that. And this is something which I do often not get, because I think we are not the best examples then for age group athletes, for young people who want to get into triathlon, for example. Because if you want to make clear that your 7.5 hour ride plus your 2 hour brick run is what you need to do in pro triathlon, I'm sorry, but I've never seen one of the good guys doing it. So I've never seen Jan Frodeno riding 7.5 hours and doing a 2 hour long run as a brick run after it. Because I think that does not really make sense. And therefore, if we point that out as something heroic, you'll have to do and want to get applause on it on Strava. Maybe I'm too old for that or something. I don't know, but that does not really make sense to me. And therefore, I'm always a fan of, let's put it the other way around. It probably not annoys me, but I'm a fan of sometimes making triathlon not too complicated. And you do not need to be the one with the most training volume. You do not need to be the one with the 7s or 8s or 4th gadget you're using in training, for example. Because in the end, it's about basic work in swim, bike, run, and probably the off-bike training. And that's it. And you can also do it with your whatever, $2,000 bike you bought on eBay, for example, and you can still be a fantastic triathlete and be successful even in your whatever age group, for example. And therefore, don't make it too complicated. Do not look on Strava what the others are doing, because there are only the sessions online, in my opinion, that need to be online on Strava, especially for the ones who are complaining to make it very special in training. And let's take it all a little bit easier, but focus on the basic stuff we need to do right.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer, and I can vouch for that from personal experience about Strava. For example, I was never a big Strava user, but I do have a Strava account, and my training was connected. And then one day I decided that I'm gonna stop. I completely stopped uploading anything to Strava. I don't have any sessions there for probably 3 years, and it did, in some small way, it did change my mentality to training. Like it wasn't. I didn't have to, run those extra 10 seconds per kilometer or bike those extra 15-20 watts. And I think it made my training a lot better, frankly, even if I never thought that it affected me directly, but probably subconsciously it still did. And especially if you're but I, at the same time, I think that's maybe one reason that we have those hero days, is that actually it does potentially give you followers on social media, and it does give some interesting sponsor exposure, sponsor content. So it would be interesting to hypothetically think about how would training change if social media did not exist.
Good point. And I mean, it's always the same. You will always find someone on Strava who trained more on that day compared to yourself. And you will always find someone on Instagram who looks more beautiful, or whose training looks more easier, or whose successes are bigger than yours. And like you said, some subconsciousness, it will definitely impact you, even if you do not want to have it, or even if you do not think it really works. So I very often, too often, said to athletes, stop being on social media, delete your Strava account, or do not look into it. Because every second or third day, the comments were like, well, have you seen this and that ride of this guy on Strava? And I'm always like, no, because I absolutely do not care. And if you hear that on every second or third day, even if your coached athlete says, well, I'm not really into it, but have you seen the ride? Then you 100% can be safe. It affects him. If he knows it or not, probably a question, but it will definitely affect him. And he will ask himself or herself, she will ask herself why she just did a 4-hour ride, while others, probably competing in the same race or on the same PTO tour or whatsoever, had a 7-hour ride. And in the end, I think you'll have to have a strong self-confidence, for example, to really be on Strava saying, well, you little lads, do whatever you want in training. In the end, I'm the one being up on the podium, whereas you guys, you Strava heroes, won't be. And I think you won't find too many athletes with that attitude and being that self-confident. And therefore, just skip it. I mean, and Strava is a nice tool. I have an account on my own, and I have, I watched it yesterday by accident, 120 requests actually. So nearly as much requests than I have followers, because I'm never on there. I do not even understand how I can follow people. But sometimes you are on training camp, you want to check comms, for example, just for fun, and probably want to hunt them. Makes sense. Still okay. And then if Fabian Cancellara is the one who has the com, you can also be fine with it, that it's Fabian Cancellara who owns it and not yourself. So therefore, all okay. But it should be just for the fun, and it shouldn't be something where you compare others, probably also to yourself from day to day. So therefore, just, keep it down a little bit.
Yeah. So I will have to metaphorically run to the next meeting in 9 minutes. So let's take 4 minutes to discuss about your wind tunnel project. What's coming up? When is it launching? And you decide what to do with those 4 minutes. And then we do some quick listener questions.
Yeah, we do it in a second or third episode probably. And then we talk about all aerodynamical gains you can have with your position, with your bike and everything. Maybe the main point to point out, and I'm doing it not in the same aero way the others are doing it probably, but your whole position, you and your machine, is a big thing in triathlon. You can lose a lot of time by not having a good position, and you can gain a lot of minutes by having a really, really good position. And the good stuff about it, and that's my keynote on this in these 4 minutes, is everyone should think of his position not first from an aerodynamical position, but more from a comfort and biomechanical perspective, probably. Are you having any issues with your position? Are you really sitting stable on your bike? Do you have any whatever issues skin wise? Do you have any issues that you have sleeping hands, sleeping feet whatsoever, or neck stiffness after being in aero position? And if so, get yourself a good bike fitting, probably get yourself a good physiotherapist. And in the end, if you've finished or started that journey, then you can probably come to the wind tunnel, because we'll find a lot of watts to save. But first things first, like I said, do the basic stuff right first. And that's the same with the wind tunnel. I won't be the one pointing out that the wind tunnel is a must-have for everyone. First of all, do the basic stuff right. Have fun while riding without having any issues. And then consider if you want to save some minutes because of and probable aero optimization from you and your position in your bike.
Why did you decide to build an actual wind tunnel? I mean, it's pretty unique because other wind tunnels existing are maybe big universities or like automotive industry with massive budgets and completely different scale than an endurance coaching business. So yeah,
absolutely right. But if I see the numbers of bike fittings we are doing per year, it's already pretty high. And then what we did so far is already doing aero testings in the velodrome. And we did that for example, in Germany, but also in Los Angeles, in Italy, in Valencia, in Spain, and I don't know, on 10, 15 different velodromes so far, with a lot of professional athletes, mainly, because it's not easy to get an appointment on a velodrome, because it's like in Germany, it's normally in public hands. So it's always complicated to get a day in the velodrome. And therefore, we made it more or less exclusive for professional athletes. But what we definitely see is that there is a niche market for also age group athletes who want to put some effort into their positions, for example, and who want to be faster by optimizing their aero position. And therefore, we thought it's probably a good idea to build a wind tunnel, which is also open to the public and is, in my opinion, or as far as I know, the only wind tunnel in mid-Europe where you can book an appointment on the internet and start your journey to your better aerodynamical position. And hopefully there's a market. I mean, we'll see. Just by building it, I can't be 100% sure that the market will definitely be there.
Yeah, well, no, that makes some sense. And final question on that. If you have one generic tip for aerodynamics, what would you say?
Get yourself a stable position first, because every movement you have on your saddle will even get higher the more fatigued you are. So while in a race, for example, and the less you move, the more stable you are, and especially the more relaxed you are, for example, in your shoulders, the more potential you have in your CDA values, so your aerodynamic values in the end. And therefore, don't think of tires, wheels, drinking systems, or 3D printed cockpits, for example, at first. These are points 17, 21, and 25 probably. But first of all, stable, comfortable, relaxing position where you'll have a lot of potential to adapt to get better aero values.
Yeah. So let's say let's take one or two listener questions here. First, this one is from Oscar. He asked this for another guest as well, but I'll ask this one from you. Do you think there are differences in optimal training for women and men on average?
Sure, 100%. I mean, if you just see the normal cycle, and if you would include that one into training, then you'll have the answer for that. There's definitely a difference in the average training. Yeah, I would say yes.
And from Neil, 2 questions. Do you consider VLA max a physiologically valid and practically useful concept?
I would say if you test the VLA max right, and if you have testings and retestings so that you see the development also of the raw data and everything, and know what you've done in training, then you can link the outcome in the testing and the training, and then it makes sense. but I would not say, and the same answer would be for VO2 max, by the way. VO2 max testings in running can make sense, but also doesn't if you do not have a clue how you got there and what your running economy, for example, is. So therefore, I think the specific look on just one metric is always a bit limited, but the VLA max can be a very valuable parameter within a physiological profile, for example, of an athlete.
And what is listener question? What is the rationale of using longer than typical rests between sweet spot / FTP intervals? I actually don't know if you've talked about this maybe on some other podcast, because I don't think we talked about this in our last interview. So I don't know what the rests typically are, but this is the question.
And you mean the rest? So
between intervals.
Rest? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, depends on what you want to have. If you want to have a higher metabolical impact, then you can short the rest between your high intensity sessions and start the next sessions with like 8 millimoles of lactate in your blood, for example. That could also make sense, but I'm always a fan of making it halfway long. And then it often is a thing about topography and whatever your course you're training on and everything. So I would say the more intensive it is, the longer the resting time can be. But it's also a thing. I mean, if the next traffic light is in 3 minutes, then do the next traffic light and start your next interval again, even if there were 6 minutes on the plan, and then it's totally fine. I mean, resting times between intervals, if it's halfway, okay, it's not a big thing to consider whether it's like 4 or 6 minutes, for example. So take it however it comes and makes halfway sense to deal with the effort, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, I want to add something from my personal perspective here, because this is something that I have been thinking about quite a bit. But I think that it's much more common that people take too short rests than too long rests, and I think at the end of the day, it's more important that the total amount of work you do than the work to rest ratio, and doing things 100%. On a really short turnaround. Okay, final question. So instead of rapid fire questions, I'm going to ask guests to pick their podiums for the Olympics this year. So pick the gold, silver, and bronze for the men and women in the Olympics.
Wow. Honestly, I'm not into all these guys and girls about their actual training and everything. But if I would need to pick 3, I'll say UK is winning both. Alex Yee and Beth Potter on 1. And you can now tell me that Beth Potter is injured, and then I'm outing myself as someone who's not following the Olympic distance as intensive as I do for mid and long distance. Second at the men's field will be Christian Blumfeld. So they having the turnaround from the last Olympics, and then third, probably let's keep the German flag high. Tim Helwig, absolutely surprising on the race day of the Olympics, becoming third. So therefore, I'll having Alex Yee, Christian Blumfeld, and Tim Helwig 1, 2, 3 at the men's field, and Beth Potter. Oh God! By the Cassandra on the second, I would say. And third, again, German flag, Laura Lindemann, especially because I would love her and also her coach Dan seeing on the podium at the Olympics. That would be great. So therefore, Beth, Cassandra, Laura.
I didn't know that Dan coaches Laura. That's interesting.
Yeah, and therefore I, as far as I can see that sometimes on social media, she's in halfway good in good shape. And on a very good way to the Olympics. So there will be a massive thing also for German triathlon. So therefore, Laura and Tim on 3.
Yeah, I'm gonna give my picks as well, and then I'm gonna make a spreadsheet with my picks and all the guests, and we can track that leading up to the Olympics. But I'm going on the men's side. I'm going Alex Yee as well, and I'm going Dorian Connings, Vasco Vilasa, second and third. A bit of rooting for the home boy there with living in Portugal, but I think Vasco has proven himself to be very capable of medaling. On the women's side, Beth Potter, I agree. Cassandra Beaugrand, and I'm going Emma Lombardi. I'm a big fan of Emma Lombardi and the way she races, so I think those are my picks. And 3 French on the podium. I think the French will be really strong, and it's more a question of, on the men's side, it's almost, I knew that I wanted one French guy on the podium, but I wasn't sure who, but I'm going Dorian.
Perfect. Good picks.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this, Björn. We gotta run. I gotta run, but it was great to have this chat. Really appreciate it, and let's do it again another time.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. It was a really great chat from my perspective, and if I hadn't had another meeting coming up, then we could probably have kept talking for quite a long time. Still, I at least had lots of questions still on my questions sheet, so hopefully we can get to them in a future interview. But as always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, and be sure to also check out episode 291, which was the first time I interviewed Björn back in 2021, where we go specifically into topics like swim, bike, and run training, and Björn gives a systematic overview of his methodology within each and within triathlon as a whole, and lots more. So that's well worth a listen. Now, let me just share some of my personal takeaways from this interview, and the first one is about patience and acceptance when you have setbacks like illness, injury, and so on. So something that we discussed earlier in the interview. This is one of the easiest things to say and one of the hardest things to do, I feel, in endurance sports, because we all want to be out there training, and when we're not, we want to get back there as quickly as humanly possible. So one thing that I found works well to avoid that trap of impatience and making mistakes related to impatience, to getting back too quickly, is to fill the time that you would normally spend training with some other thing that you feel is a genuine positive and a genuine pleasure in your life. So maybe it's studying a topic that you wanted to dive into but you haven't had time for, or maybe it's focusing more on your friends and your social life. Maybe it's playing a musical instrument or spending more time in nature. But I think that any of these can work, or many other things, of course. But the mistake that I've made for sure is to use the time that I couldn't train for whatever reason to just do more work instead, or even just more life admin. And I don't think that that's good in any way, because it can get you feeling very low when you're used to having that training as a bit of a personal time away from the normal day to day. And when you use that time for something else that is different, that you really like, but you normally don't do because you normally choose to spend most of your free time beside work and family obligations on training, then that puts you in a much more happier and more patient mental state in my experience. So rather than spending extra time working, for example, spend that extra time playing the guitar or whatever it might be that brings you some joy in your life. So that's my first takeaway and or continued point on one of the things that Björn discussed. Then the second point is about run training. So here the focus is clearly on superb consistency and minimizing risks and relatively frequent exposure to moderately fast running. But if you look into any individual session, they all seem to look quite modest, not really being too hard or too challenging. So those were some of the key aspects that Björn talked about in how he designs the run training. And then my takeaway, or how I think about that, is that this is a great example of how within triathlon you can't just consider the 3 disciplines in a vacuum, but you have to think about interactions. And my interpretation here is that Björn uses a pretty high volume of cycling to build up great general cardiovascular and metabolic fitness, and then a lot of that carries over into running in terms of general fitness, and then for the running component itself, he can be quite focused on running economy, which doesn't seem to need a big total running load or big loads within individual sessions, but it's more about a good kind of specific load, relatively frequently. So that is all my interpretation of Björn's training and Björn's and the physiology in general, based on the discussion we had. But I think I find it very interesting and definitely a bit different to how I do things and how you hear a lot of people doing things, but super interesting and definitely something that I would like to experiment with. And the final takeaway that I have is there is no one size fits all, because for almost everything we talked about, you can find examples of successful athletes and coaches doing almost the exact opposite. Well, not quite, or the big things are all the same, which is consistency, not getting injured, not getting ill, so focusing on risk minimization. Those are all things that are actually very much the same across the board. But in terms of more nuanced things and detailed things within the training, that's where you can find examples of from one extreme to the other almost. So for example, you find athletes doing really well on high running volume and keeping most sessions really, really easy with 1 to 2 sessions of quite high load that try to quote unquote move the needle, which would be kind of the opposite of what we discussed here with Björn and my previous takeaway. And as far as general advice goes, that's probably something that I've said on this podcast several times, because that's something that I generally kind of try to do in my coaching. So basically advising to keep the easy sessions easy, the hard sessions hard. And I know that there have been other guests on that have said similar things as well. But the summary or the takeaway here is that this goes to the main objective of this podcast, is to show all of these different ways that there exist to achieve success and demonstrate that there is no one right answer. And I think that this interview really did that. So it's not that anything that Björn is saying or doing is very unconventional or anything like that, but just that in the details, in the smaller details, there are differences compared to what you might have heard before. And that's not to say that this is the new best thing, or that the other things are wrong, or the opposite of that, but it's just to show that that there are many roads that lead to Rome within triathlon. And I asked Björn the question about if there's anything that frustrates him in the zeitgeist of triathlon, and if I were personally to answer that question, it would probably be the tendency that you have to choose sides, you have to pick A versus B, and even letting this be part of your identity or your brand, and not allowing yourself to change opinions, or blasting people that do change opinions. So this is so to sum up this takeaway, I would say that we shouldn't let our identities as athletes or as coaches be tied to any method or strategy or tactic, whatever you want to call it, because then you just put yourself in a really small box and you might not be able to benefit from the different ways of approaching things that you come across. For example, some of the things that Björn talked about here might be quite new to some people, and certainly for me, there are some things that I haven't used that much in my coaching and that I am now super interested in maybe experimenting with a bit. But if you strongly identify with any given training method or tactic, then you'll be much less receptive to these new ideas and inputs. So I think that being curious and open-minded and even being open to changing your mind about things, that those are all really important things. But that kind of the trend is almost the opposite, that we have to have strong stances on everything. So I think that that's something that that we should be careful not to fall into that trap. And then the final point here related to the interview is the Olympic picks that we did, podium picks. I have put up a Google sheet with Björn's and mine picks, and I will do that for all the guests that we get on in the future that I will ask this question for. So that will be a fun little build up or lead up to the Olympics, and we can follow along, and then we can see after the Olympics who did the best, and maybe there is some fun reward for the person that wins or does the best picks. But anyway, I'll put the link to that Google sheet in the show notes so that you can check, and I will be updating that Google sheet whenever we have a new a new response. So then I'll put it in all of the episode descriptions, episode show notes for future episodes, so that you can always follow along and see who has picked who, and maybe you can keep your own picks in your own mind or in a document and see how you do against the expert guests of the podcast. And then a final piece of housekeeping is that, as I talked about in the last episode, we now have a new coach on the Scientific Triathlon team who is onboarded and taking on clients. I want to just very briefly discuss the recruitment process. So we had 29 candidates selected for the first round of interviews and many, many more applications than that. So of course, when you have 29 candidates that were as good as they were being selected for interviews, then that means that I got to talk to a lot of absolutely fantastic coaches with lots of experience and knowledge, including experience from the very highest level of the sport. So it was frankly a very luxurious position to be in, having so many amazing candidates to choose from. But in the end, and it was a very hard choice, I have to say, but in the end, the coach that is now part of the Scientific Triathlon team is Tobias Toby Haumann from Germany. He has been coaching since 2010 and has worked with athletes from beginners to professional athletes, has raced triathlon himself from the draft legal Bundesliga first division races to Ironman and ultra running, ultra marathon races, and has all the skills and characteristics, especially that we want in a coach here at Scientific Triathlon. So as I said, he's already taking on athletes. So check out our coaching page and Toby's profile on scientifictriathlon.com to learn more, and contact us if you are looking for a coach, and maybe Toby will be a good fit for you. Next episode, I interview Rune Talsnes, Dr. Rune Talsnes, and we discuss topics like overtraining, periodization research that he has conducted, basically whether it makes sense to progress intensity versus progress volume within a block of general preparation. We discuss best practices within cross-country skiing, because Rune's specialty is within cross-country skiing, and we have a bunch of listener questions as well, which I will keep putting out requests for as much as I can remember for most interviews that I do anyway. So follow us on Scientific Triathlon HQ on Instagram. That's normally where I put out those requests for questions in the stories. And so yeah, if you follow along there, you'll get the chance to ask questions for upcoming interviews. But anyway, the interview with Rune is already recorded. It was a very good one, and that will be out I'm not sure, actually, maybe in 2 weeks or maybe in 1 week, depending on when I get time to edit it. So let's see, but that's the next one in the lineup. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. If you're looking for high quality, practical and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure that you try Precision Fuel and Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to choose, so you can easily find your personal favorite. Don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 swim trainer is a great tool to have in your toolbox to improve your technique and power, and to target specific aspects of your stroke, and to maintain consistency when you don't have time to get to the pool. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.